this is not easy. So there are a lot of barriers to dealing with conflicts and to negotiating effectively. And sometimes we quickly move to how do we do this without really analyzing and understanding the challenges in front of us. One of the real challenges when you're dealing with negotiation and conflict is that there are all kinds of perceptions and assumptions that we bring to the table that we're unaware that we're even making. That people sit down with each other and they actually think they're talking about the same thing, and they're often not. There was a very interesting study that was done at Stanford about 2 years ago that said that in any situation that we find ourselves in, we only notice 30% of what's going on around us. So flip that around, you don't notice 70% of what's going on. So it's kind of rare that you and the other person or people involved in something are actually going to be looking at the same data. You start out with the same information, but the minute you start adding your own meaning and judgment, it's no longer just data, right? It's data with judgment and biases built in because you're focusing on certain things. You know, the more that I've done this, the more that I see this being one of the biggest problems that people are completely unaware of. And the way the latter can be helpful is to say, and when I am dealing with somebody who's got a very different perspective than me, I say, look, can you help me to understand how you reached that conclusion? So how did you get from this information that we're both looking at to there, because I've drawn a different conclusion, right? And so I'm trying to get them to walk me down their ladder. Because otherwise you just don't realize that you're talking past each other. It's like ships in the night. And it's a really big problem. Because one of the first things I do when I sit down to negotiate with somebody is I say, no, this is going to sound strange, but can you just tell me what you think we're negotiating about? And they look at me like, are you serious? And I say, yes, I am. And more often than not, they say something that I was not aware of. Okay, so try not to make the assumption you know, like what you're talking about or what the issue is from their perspective. Because there is an element in there that you haven't perhaps thought of, okay? Now, let me just ask you, let me give you a quick challenge, and I drove past some horses today, so this should be a reasonable one for all of you. So there's this horse in the middle of the field, okay, and there's 25 feet between the horse and the hay, and there's 15 feet of rope tied to the horse. The horse is about 6 feet long. So the question I have for you, is he gonna starve? How many of you think he's going to starve? Does anybody not think he's going to? Why don't you think he's going to starve? Yes?
Why? We'll just cut the rope.
Well, there's nobody else around. So it's just him and the hay's over there, horse is here, there's nobody around to help him out. Yeah?
The rope can be placed between the two. So there's 15 feet of rope, and he could actually, if he's halfway between the two, he should be able to.
So it's tied, it is tied around his neck.
Right, but it doesn't say it's tied to anything else.
It doesn't say it's tied to anything else. So it's not tied to anything. How many of you made the assumption that the other end of the rope was tied to something else? Yes. Okay, now, well, who knows, right? But we just talked about assumptions and perceptions, right? And we just did it again. Okay? So my point is, this is so easy, and this happens all the time. And so the only way to deal with this challenge is to have your assumptions checker on and say, what am I assuming? When I sit down and work with people in conflict, I say, I want you to write down for me on the left side of the paper, tell me what the other side has told you is going on in this situation. And I want you to write down everything else that you think is part of the situation. And the other column, write down everything else, is all the assumptions, and it's usually 2 to 3 times longer than what they actually know, right? So this is a huge one, so don't poo-poo it if you're poo-pooing it. It's really important to kind of get your head around the fact that we do this all the time, and it makes our life a lot harder because we don't even know we're not talking about the right thing until much later when you realize, wow, we weren't even having the same conversation.